Good evening. This is a lecture that can be called towards a non-partisan search for a pro-people national political economic strategy during crisis. My particular case here will be Bangladesh, but it can be applied to many other countries and economies like Bangladesh. To sum up, before I get started with the main argument about Bangladesh, Bangladesh is potentially capable of rapid, self-reliant, and equitable development under a committed, development-oriented leadership. The crucial tactical question right now is how the currently successful policies can be continued and even better policies devised for the future. Thinking strategically for the medium to long term, the combination of strategic openness and self-reliance requires firm, skillful, and committed leadership at all levels. The current situation in Bangladesh is fragile, even perilous, precisely because the tentative moves towards a self-reliant and pro-people political and economic system under the dedicated leadership of patriotic elements have not been a consistent feature since liberation. In addition to confronting the current political changes and challenges tactically, our medium to long-run strategic perspective must involve a genuine private-public partnership with proper incentives for patriotic elements in the private sector and for efficient and equitable delivery of services by the public sector. At the same time, our economic advisors must think seriously about gradual reduction of reliance on the undesirable and burdensome elements of the so-called foreign aid, much of which has created political and economic dependence and a domestic parasitic clientelism for big capital from advanced countries. While we must be open towards genuine development projects funded by donors who will build our domestic capabilities, for example, building the Padma Setu and other infrastructural projects, we must reject the Trojan horse of aid that forces the adoption of neoliberal policies and weakens our sovereignty. While acknowledging and encouraging even the work of genuinely good NGOs for human development in Bangladesh, we must also reject the manipulative use of big NGOs to sabotage the authority of a people's government in Bangladesh led by patriotic, popular, pro-liberation forces. On the positive side, we must emphasize the building of governance institutions according to the ideals that reflect the will of the people who fought for our liberation, particularly secularism, democracy, sovereignty, and social justice. 9 specific strategic areas ranging from strategic openness to innovation and building up of human resources through progressive educational and other policies will be discussed later. But to begin, we are in a crisis situation globally right now with an ongoing global financial and economic crisis with tepid recovery at best at the time of this talk, as well as the still unfolding ecological crisis. The 21st century presents an even greater challenge for self-reliant industrialization in the developing world than the post-World War II period. The changed global economic and ecological environment will shape the emergence of new technological and industrial paradigms and trajectories in significant ways. From this perspective, Bangladesh has a challenging task ahead. However, it is also possible for Bangladesh to leverage the advantages it has and achieve at least close to a middle-level developing country status in the first quarter of this century. On the positive side, since the mid-1990s, Bangladesh's growth performance has been widely recognized to have gone through some major transformations. It is undeniable that the rate of growth has steadily increased. At the same time, to Bangladesh's credit also, agencies like the World Bank have given it high marks for poverty reduction. Other macroeconomic indicators, such as rates of savings and investment, have increased rapidly, and export growth has been substantial. It is legitimate to ask if the country is poised to take off into an East Asian type of growth path, widely recognized now as the best practice development path in the post-World War II period, and very different from a simplistic type of Washington consensus story. Therefore, it is necessary to first identify the main strategic features of this type of development. A prior task is to clarify the concept of development itself. Also, occasionally, I will refer to the Southeast Asian economies close to Bangladesh, such as Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia, which may have, in fact will have, relevant lessons for Bangladesh. So what is development? We can clarify so that we can avoid ambiguities and confusion. I will be referring to three concepts of development that are implicit in much of the discussion in the field of industrialization and development. The first is the idea of development as growth with some structural change, or at least the idea that this type of growth is the most crucial, necessary condition for development. The second concept is derived by adding explicit distributional elements to growth, particularly inequality and poverty. Both these ideas are shared by the development economists today, at least implicitly. The third and the broadest approach to development is in terms of sense idea of capabilities and its further extensions. In this view, development is really an extension over time and space of freedom, particularly the positive freedom to lead a certain type of life an individual has reasons to value. In technical modeling of industrialization and development, including my own models, often this normative view is not adopted explicitly. Yet, insofar as there is a normative aspect about development being a public good that is a premise for the whole project of industrialization and development, such a view is consistent with the modeling approaches as well. In a recent essay on South Korean development prepared for Haider, Kohn Lee's perceptive comments on the possible role of democracy in development extends considerably the terrain of discussion in the direction of the development as freedom perspective. He writes, "We see obvious advantages in democracy, amongst which is the convenient feature that citizens are not subject to arbitrary arrest and torture. Truly strong states get it wrong more often than they get it right. Thus, the military dictatorships of Latin America left little in the way of legacy, whereas the military dictatorships in Korea and Taiwan, while not on anything like the same scale of brutality, left a powerful legacy of development. The difference lies clearly in strategic orientation and in institutional capacity in formulating and implementing a program of national industrial development. Our point is that this is an option available to the political leadership of any developing country today. On top of this, the key to the Korean or Asian success was institutional longevity. It would seem, therefore, that there is an implicit agreement in at least the post-1970 thinking that development is growth plus other things. While the list of other things may vary somewhat, none of the researchers in the field today would equate growth and development. Yet, almost all would agree that generating high growth may be a useful means towards development. Many thoughtful researchers also pay some attention to what can be called the political economy of growth and distribution. Synthesizing the experiences of the high-growth Asian economies further reveals some common strategic orientations as well as the effects of changes in external environment and shifts in policies over time. This is consistent with the characteristics of complex economic systems which are non-linear with multiple equilibria and path dependence. Over time, one may observe the emergence of structural shifts in some cases, stagnation in other cases, depending on initial conditions, strategies, policies, and external environment, among other things. In the Asian cases that I will refer to from time to time, there are many specific variations within each. However, they also share, to various degrees, many specific features to which I will now turn. First is strategic openness to various degrees, with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand being the most open and Vietnam the least. But in all cases, there is a strategic commitment to export promotion beyond an earlier period of strategic import substitution. And that strategic import substitution also happens to be very important, for which actually the World Bank and other writers who do not quite know the history of these economies thoroughly, they don't give these countries enough credit. There's a large literature on this, and it's well worth taking a look at. The second feature I want to mention is heterodox macroeconomic policies for stability. Here, China and India have been the most heterodox, but Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Korea display more of a mix of heterodox policies than Thailand. Even Hong Kong and Singapore at times have followed heterodox policies, especially on the fiscal side. It seems that the rigidity of Washington consensus, particularly in this area, is rejected by the experiences of developing countries like China, India, Korea, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Third factor is creation of institutions for productive investment. This exists in all cases, but Korea seems to have gone much farther than the others much earlier. The role of state in the creation of new institutions that can lead to this type of progress is very, very prominent even today in East Asia. In this respect, China perhaps has the most ambitious agenda, which can be discussed as a special case study. Fourth factor is agricultural development. All of these East Asian countries put through a set of policies for agricultural development. But China and Vietnam probably put through the most egalitarian pro-peasant development policies earlier. Although China has changed its policies several times, now trying to go back to a more egalitarian type of strategy for a long time, both in the Yan'an period and then post-1949 New Democracy and then Socialist period, China had the most egalitarian agricultural development policies and programs in the world. Next, number 5, industrial development and structural change. The strategic perspective in this important area suggests that the successful countries to various degrees pursued a continuously unfolding and dynamic set of policies with much trial and error. The retrospective attempts to tell a coherent story have often led to an overly deductive picture where good performances supposedly follow from a few, usually neoclassical economic principles. The Malaysian case study done by my friend Jomo and Wei is a good and convincing counterexample. Amsden and Wade discuss the cases of Korea and Taiwan, respectively, in the general East Asian context. Jomo and Wade describe some changes in strategy and policy for Malaysia within specific time-sensitive contexts. Over the years, the government has changed its industrialization strategy. In response to problems and new priorities, the government announced the Second Industrial Master Plan, IMP2, for 1996 to 2005 in December 1996 to replace the First Industrial Master Plan for 1986 to 1995. In September 1996, the government had set up the Multimedia Super Corridor, MSC, project to promote certain information technology investments. The government committed over ringgit 50 billion for infrastructure development to support this initiative. At the same time, the government strengthened intellectual property laws to reassure foreign investors and provided more generous incentives for new investments in this area. Thus, the policy changes of the mid-1980s appeared successful in reviving growth and industrialization. Confirmation of the new policy direction from the mid-1980s came with the 1991 enunciation of Vision 2020, favoring growth, modernization, and industrialization. Although FDI began leveling off in the mid-1990s, increased domestic investments, inspired by greater domestic investor confidence, sustained the momentum of rapid economic growth until the 1997-1998 regional financial crisis. The gravity of the crisis and the difficulties of recovery were exacerbated by injudicious policy responses compromised by cronyism, though there is little persuasive evidence that cronyism itself precipitated the crisis. They also point out changes in the 60s and 70s as well in response to changing global economic environment. The case study of Vietnam also confirms the suspicion that there is much that is improvised and ad hoc during the earlier phases of apparently successful development cases. The lesson here is perhaps to avoid major resource allocation distortions, as documented by the Thai case, and constant monitoring and policy revisions when existing policies don't work well. Now I turn to the sixth important factor. This is the creation of technological capabilities. Here the Korean case stands out as a very apt illustration of creating technological capabilities throughout the entire growth and development trajectory in definite stages. Among various aspects of capacities, emphasis should be on technological capabilities because without these, sustained growth is impossible. The Malaysia case study by Jomo and Wade that I referred to also recognizes this essentially strategic aspect of creating technological capabilities during medium to long-run development. It is also clear from the China, Thailand, and Vietnam cases that strategic concerns with the creation of appropriate technological capabilities have been and continue to be very important. Seventh factor is technological learning and innovation related to creation of technological capabilities and deepening of technological capabilities. Creating national innovation systems, in particular, requires the creation of specific institutions and technological learning over time. Ultimately, if development is to continue beyond the catching up phase, this may present the most crucial set of policy challenges. Both state and civil society have to play important roles. At an earlier stage, the state necessarily plays a large and activist role. At a later stage, however, the creation of technological capability has to rely on a private-public partnership at both the pre-competitive and competitive phases. Eighth factor is direct foreign investment and foreign aid. These factors have played a role for all three, but perhaps more so for Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Investment from abroad has perhaps been more significant than aid per se. However, internal generation of investable funds and public sector support have also played a crucial role, particularly in Korea, Taiwan, and China. Direct foreign investment in manufacturing sector can be important, as the Vietnam case study shows. Thoburn, for example, tells us, sectorally, manufacturing has been the most important area of direct foreign investment, with 51% of accumulated registered foreign capital over the 1988 to 2006 period, followed by transport, storage and communications, 9.6%, mining and quarrying, 8%, and real estate, 8%. In a number of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, however, the picture is the opposite. It's the real estate and some forms of financial sector operations that grow the fastest and draw hot money. Finally, one should mention poverty reduction strategies. These are a varied set of policies that are necessary in addition to growth. Although growth is a very important component of such a strategic approach to poverty reduction, in all cases, specific policies targeting both rural and urban poverty were undertaken. Although in China, the period from 1995 on was a case of neglect or even reversal, but the current leadership seems to be aware of the political economic issues raised by such neglect and is committed publicly to reverse the reversal. So where is Bangladesh in comparative terms, we might ask? A broad political economy look has to necessarily take into account both strengths and weaknesses from a strategic perspective. In spite of serious mismanagement in the past, the annual economic growth has generally been at the range of 5% or higher during more than 2 decades. During my time at the Asian Development Bank, I wrote several reports on the economic prospects of Bangladesh. On the basis of disclosed studies, I can actually say with some confidence that the development prospects for Bangladesh actually can be very bright under some circumstances. Along with efforts such as a successful population planning policy, grassroots development efforts by some patriotic activists, and also dedicated cadres and their allies, recent initiatives have enabled the country to outperform other developing countries in poverty reduction and many other aspects such as female literacy and even life expectancy. Bangladesh is making progress towards meeting many of the goals that the UN had set in the Sustainable Development Goals area. So I will briefly outline some of the strengths of Bangladesh before moving on to a discussion of the more serious problems that have impeded its political, economic, and social development so far. First of all, it has relatively homogeneous population with some important minorities whose rights need better protection, needless to say. 2, largely secular and tolerant of others historically, with some problems that are of largely post-1975 origin. 3rd, a generally growing and diversifying economy with natural gas deposits which must be used properly. 4th, good progress in communications and gradually improving physical infrastructure. 5th, success of microfinance and other poverty reduction policies, relatively speaking. 6th, success of population control policy. 7th, an increasing number of semi-skilled workers inside Bangladesh and large number of skilled and semi-skilled workers abroad. 8th, accumulated knowledge and experience domestically, human resources in national and international NGOs in various academic and other professional fields. 9th, from a historical perspective, the popular culture, consciousness, and social practices have on the whole been and largely remain, even today, free from dogmatism, rigidity, and intolerance. For Bengalis, these negative traits have characterized to this day only a minority. Unfortunately, such a minority with power and means of destruction can be quite oppressive. However, it is only fair to say the majority of Bengalis do not support such destructive oppression. This statement is supported by the evidence of recent overwhelming support for effective anti-corruption policies and move towards secularism away from Islamic fundamentalism in particular. Finally, and most importantly perhaps in my view, a history of struggling against superior but unjust state power, both during the British Raj and the Pakistani regime. The fact that these struggles were successful in large part suggests that Bangladesh has the resources for political renewal within the polity and society. However, we must ask seriously at this point what the preconditions for such renewal are. There are 5 key strategic problems in my view. My strategic list of problems is as follows. First, problem of parliamentary constitutional politics, representative democracy and its limits. Secondly, problem of economic justice, class, gender, ethnic and religious minorities. Thirdly, problem of social stratification and differentiation, including the divide among the newly rich and those who are being left behind. Fourth, problem of creating a vigorous civil society from within and not simply carry on the rhetoric of the World Bank and other NGOs from the West. Finally, problem of linking with the democratic forces internationally and delinking with the anti-democratic forces. All these problems have remained unsolved or very partially addressed at best in the last few decades for many complex historical reasons that are subjects of intense debates. Without engaging in this exercise, which is valuable but not central to my purpose here, I want to draw attention to the problem of creating the right political and civic culture without which democracy cannot function anywhere in the world. I do this not because I believe that culture is fixed as our genes are, but in the knowledge that however difficult it may be to create it, such a culture is a human creation. Furthermore, there are indigenous resources, including, as Amartya Sen and others have emphasized, a tradition of public reason and arguments. So one social scientist describes the problem and characterizes the problem at a very visceral level in the following words. The problem of Bangladesh is not one about which party governs, but what political class most of our leaders come from, and the behavioral and attitudinal patterns they represent. We live in an environment of conspicuous consumption by the elite, a culture of arrogance, cynicism, and bullying, where the ability to circumvent the laws is claimed as a hallmark of status and power. An atmosphere that has led to the criminalization of politics and politicization of crime. Our leaders impugn the patriotism of anybody who disagrees with them, use the word conspiracy as a weapon in their demagogic repertoire, and hound the opposition with sneering impatience and petty vengefulness. There is often a contradiction between the rhetorical flourishes they employ and the personal example they set. For instance, they will speak about the need to preserve the Bangla language and culture with seeming passion, but will send their children to English medium schools. They will cry themselves hoarse, warning us about environmental crises, but build high-rise buildings without any concern about their impact on urban blight. They will be eloquent about the need for moral clarity, but will have no problems winking their way through the ethical thicket of institutionalized graft and bribery. They will decry the politics of agitation, confrontation, and brinksmanship, but engage in it themselves at the first opportunity. They will glorify the democratic process, but then undermine the parliament. They will loudly proclaim that religion is a private matter and there must be a wall of separation between mosque and state, but will make sure that their visit to Saudi Arabia and their participation in religious functions are widely publicized. They will forever express their solidarity with the people, but not care about the suffering their public policies or political strategies impose on them. They will be eloquent in defense of freedom of the press, but attack journalists and file cases against them if their investigations cut close to home. They will encourage political constancy and ideological commitment in others, but themselves function in a system of shabby bickering and horse trading, fluid alliances and fungible loyalties, and be chameleon-like in their ability to change color and direction depending on immediate advantage and opportunity. The political elite dismisses concerns about intellectual honesty or charges of hypocrisy as the work of, what else? Conspirators. They seek power and are not bothered that they do not have moral authority. There are, of course, striking and outstanding individual exceptions. However, generally, they have collectively helped to institute a system of crony capitalism through the formation of a klepto-patrimonial, rent-seeking, predatory state, which has not failed but has probably been struggling for some time. In the hands of the same leadership class, it is destined to continue in the same direction. If we leave the foxes to guard the hen house, does it matter what party comes to power? That administrative changes are instituted and what procedures are put in place. Unless we can find credible means to change the political culture within which we function and affect the attitudes, values, and indulgences of our political elite, the viability of democracy will be doubtful. With this in mind, I now propose 10 strategic questions that we need to answer to make the prospects for sustainable democracy credible. First, how to offer security of life, liberty, personal property of citizens, and property of corporate bodies in the civil society and the state. Second, how to ensure that justice is done and that the situation does not deteriorate into cycles of political retribution and revenge. Third, how to establish and preserve the integrity of the electoral process. Fourth, how to make the parliamentary process effective. Fifth, how to ensure optimal social investment for infrastructure, industrial, and overall human development. Sixth, how to make the bureaucracy, the armed forces, and police accountable. Seventh, how to empower people and make local government more effective in delivering services. Eighth, how to control corruption and greed systematically by strengthening an independent judiciary and enforcement. Ninth, how to reform the educational system so that productive and politically aware citizenship is the end result. 10th, how to reduce poverty through overall human and sustainable development so that the poor can participate meaningfully in the overall development process. It's the second part of this proposition or question that is the most important. Just taking a few people out of the poverty, above the poverty line is not good enough. We must actually make them citizens and able to participate overall in the process. So my conclusion is that Bangladesh has accelerated growth rate, has built some progressive track record, but it is not on the East Asian strategic path. However, it can be argued that it can be on such a path. And I will not spend too much time on this. I have written about this elsewhere. But the challenges that I've mentioned previously must be overcome in a credible way. Let me just focus on something that requires a domestic solution more than anything else, and this is the problem of governance. There is much talk of good governance by the World Bank and various other organizations. Undoubtedly, good governance is necessary. But the challenge for a poor country like Bangladesh is to focus on concrete aspects of good political and economic governance. Although much remains to be done, the orientation of the current politically aware new generation, young people in Bangladesh towards social justice, improving infrastructure, protecting energy and other natural resources, and reducing foreign dependence are definitely in the right direction. A move towards stamping out corruption in high places, complemented by an egalitarian strategy of development geared towards poverty reduction, inequality reduction, employment creation, and support for small businesses and farmers, will go a long way towards creating a healthy political economy. A new social and political movement must maintain the political loyalty of the base of urban, middle, and working classes, rural peasantry, and patriotic elements among land and capital-owning classes. With their help, the tendencies towards capabilities-enhancing development in the sense of Sen and others need to be widened and deepened. Building up a core of younger leaders and expanding the existing bands of patriotic and dedicated cadres for nation building will isolate the anti-people elements in our society and help build the Sonar Bangla that millions of patriotic Bengalis fought for and gave their lives for during our liberation struggle. Thank you.